All right, well, we might as well get started. So you probably have gathered this by now, but I'm Aaron Pratt. I'm the Carl and Lily Forsheimer Curator of Early Books and Manuscripts at the Ransom Center. Although, as you can see here, I am in full civilian mode, sitting here in my back room office, away from the collections that I oversee, which is a real bummer. But I got strong-armed by our very persuasive marketing team into doing a Facebook Live Q&A from home about, in part about the Stories to Tell exhibition that I had up until we closed called Illustrating Early English Drama. And that particular exhibition, that Stories to Tell display, is one that I sort of remediated in the form of a Ransom Center magazine post online. So you should be able to see photographs of all of the playbooks that I had out for that. And you should also be able to see the label text that I wrote for that particular display. As you probably gather, I can be a little wordy when it comes to my labels, so I'm hoping that they'll have a decent permanent life up there on the blog. And I tried to provide a decent amount of context for why it is that I think these particular playbooks are so interesting. What I'll, I guess, say for now while I wait for some questions to show up, because I'm really going to need your questions, guys, is that, you know, when I was an undergraduate student at Ohio State, entirely too long ago now, I was asked to read, I think it was Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, and that same semester I also read Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy. And in the edition that I was reading of those particular plays, each of them printed a reproduction of a title page illustration that circulated with those particular plays. And I was really interested in the fact that, you know, I had been taught to sort of read printed plays as a sort of way to access the world of performance, right? These are plays, these are written for the stage, at least in most cases. And something like Dr. Faustus, I was taught to read it to think about what it might have looked like when it was being performed on London stages in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. But the illustrations on the title pages, to me anyway, looked like they were trying to represent aspects of the fictional worlds of these particular plays rather than anything like the appearance of performers on a London stage. If you have access to the Ransom Center magazine article, and you can scroll down to reproductions of both the Spanish Tragedy title page from 1633 and the earliest Dr. Faustus playbook that we have here at the Ransom Center, which is from 1663. And in both of those illustrations, you can see, you know, like in Spanish Tragedy, you see four of the characters, each of whom, or three of the four, have banderoles or speech bubbles coming out of their mouths, delivering lines. All of those actors in the basic prop of this sort of trellis, all of those things would have been possible to have in London's theaters. And we know that London's theater companies invested quite a bit in elaborate costuming. But you can see in those illustrations that the artist of the illustration has gone to some effort to show the floor, the ground, not a wooden stage, but the earthy ground under the feet of the characters, under the feet of the characters. And I was really interested in that fact, like, why is it that this particular kind of book that I've always been taught was the kind of book that you read in order to access the world of performance? Why is it that that particular playbook was interested in showing something that looked to me like more like the fictional world of the play rather than the world of theatrical performance? The same is kind of true for the Dr. Faustus woodcut, where you see Dr. Faustus standing inside of his magic circle with the devil coming up from the floor. And you see him situated in his study. And so you not only see the sort of floor with the circle, but you see books in the background, you see a window, you see the kind of things that say, this is a scholar in his study, not this is an actor playing a scholar in his study on the London stage. And so I've spent really an entirely too long a period of my academic life trying to understand exactly why it is that people read plays. What is it that attracted folks in the 16th and 17th century to reading play scripts, which are, you know, I mean, yes, there are people who read modern play scripts today, but those tend to be folks that are really interested in the world of the theater. And in early modern England, it seemed like the story with the printed playbook was something a bit more complicated, one where the playbook, even though it often emerges from a context of performance, seems interested in actually making it possible not to have performance when you access it. That is to say, playbooks do a lot of work to make their fictional worlds legible outside of the context of performance. And so with the illustrated playbooks that I focused on for this Stories to Tell display, I was interested in sort of showing how it is that the illustrations and printed playbooks in England from 16th through early 18th centuries give us a sense of the play's fictional worlds, or at least the world, the sort of identities of the characters in the space that they inhabit in the fictional world of the play, rather than the world of the stage. Okay, so that's enough for a prelude for me. For the love of God, somebody asked me a question, or I'm going to lose my mind. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, so I've got a question from Chrissy, who's interested in the woodblocks being reused. She's asking, how are they traced and have any survived? And also, what caused the change in going from images of single characters to a snapshot of the action on the stage? Okay, there's a lot there, and those are really very good questions, in fact. Okay, so the earliest playbooks that we know that survive that have illustrations, and I say this in my sort of intro text, the very first playbook that seems to survive of an English play that was published in England is Henry Medwall's Fulgens and Lucrece. Now, Ransom Center is not fortunate enough to own a copy of that, but that's, you know, a book that was published in the second decade of the 16th century, and its title page features a single woodcut that shows a woman facing a male courtier, and they're doing the kind of things that suggest courtship. And so that you know, illustration gives you a sense of the sort of major characters, Fulgens and Lucrece, and it also gives you a sense of the basic romantic context, the wooing context of the play. So we don't think that with these earliest plays, Fulgens and Lucrece, the Interlude of Youth, which we do have a 1557 copy of here at the Ransom Center, we don't think that those woodcuts were designed for the playbooks themselves. What you have is a series of what are often called factotum woodcuts, which is to say woodcuts that have a sort of banner at the top that allowed the printer to insert metal type, and they could relabel these particular characters however, you know, whatever the context demanded. And so we think that with these earliest playbooks, you have these sort of, what am I thinking? These sort of catch-all woodcuts, or these utterly sort of generic woodcuts that can be juxtaposed on the face of title pages in order to give a basic sense of like, okay, this is a play about two characters named X and Y, or this is a play about characters named X, Y, and Z. And those seem to be reused for all kinds of books. Part of the challenge, of course, well, part of the challenge, not of course, is that we don't usually have everything that survives from those early periods, especially the first half of the 16th century, really into the 17th century, where a lot of these particular woodcuts would have first appeared. One of the things that we're fairly certain about is that a lot of these woodcuts, like the kind you see on the title page of the Interlude of Youth, would have been used to illustrate ballads. And ballads were usually published sort of like a poster on one side as what we call a broadsheet. And those particular ballads, you know, could be stuck to your wall. And for a number of reasons, not least of which is the fact that they were meant to be posters, don't really survive very well. And so it becomes really challenging to trace what exactly the order of operations is for the use of these earliest illustrations that show up in playbooks. But we, okay, so we don't have any of the blocks. None of the actual blocks survive of playbook illustrations from this period. There are a number of woodblocks that survive, especially from the Continental Press, the Antwerp Press of Plantin Moretus. They still have a large number of their woodcuts. And at the Ransom Center, we're actually really fortunate to own a very large format poster sized woodcut of a saint from northern Italy that was probably cut in the late 15th century, and that survives at the Ransom Center, which is very surprising. There are also a number of early woodcut blocks that survive elsewhere. There are lots of the woodcuts that I know the best that survive, the wood blocks that survive the best that I know of, tend to be from herbals, books that print pictures of plants and describe the botanical landscape of the early modern world. Okay, so what caused the change in going from images of single characters to a snapshot of, and I'm not sure that I have the best answer for you. But one of the things, and I should say, to a snapshot of the action on the stage, as I was trying to suggest a minute ago, I actually think that these tend to be less interested in showing the action on the stage rather than the action that's happening in the fictional world. And I think that that's a distinction that I want to maintain. Because again, I think that a lot of the story that we've been told about printed playbooks, especially in the sort of non-scholarly context of, say, like an undergraduate classroom, or when you hear up kind of public talk, is that I really want to push against the idea that people were mostly reading plays as surrogates of performance. That is to say, I want to suggest fairly strongly that when people were reading plays in a way that's sort of alien to us today, in early modern England and early modern Europe more broadly, I think, they were able to read plays as a source of narrative fiction, even though those plays lack the kind of exposition that tends to define the experience of reading stories today, right? We don't define the telling of narrative primarily by the speech acts that are being represented by dialogue, but we actually expect prose narrative to include exposition of some kind. Where are they? What are the events? What are the inner thoughts? Those kinds of things. And it seems like in early modern England, for a handful of reasons, readers were quite good, in fact, at reading play scripts and imagining a fictional world that existed beyond it, through the stage, rather, through the page to a fictional world that existed beyond it. Okay, so what caused the change in characters to snapshots of action? I think part of this, and this is a really complicated story that I want to make sure I don't spend too much time on so that we can get to some more questions. But one of the things that you see in the early publication of plays in the 16th century is some uncertainty about what the hell a printed playbook is for. And so when I'm talking now about people in the early modern England being able to read plays for fiction, that's not something that it's clear that publishers and printers understood when they first started issuing these things. One of the things we see a lot in the earliest printed playbooks, including the ones without illustrations, is a list of characters, not exactly a dramatis personae, but a sort of predecessor of that, which lists the names of the various characters in it and often tells you just how many actors it would take to play it, so that you can sort of have a doubling scheme where one person could play multiple parts. In these early playbooks, especially these kind of in the 1550s, 1560s, 1570s, they tend to want to say something about, like, with this playbook script, and you had X number of people, you could perform this play, and here are the characters. And so it seems like in those particular playbooks, that particular feature seems to be trying to say something about this sort of idea that one might take the playbook and use it for the purposes of performance. But of course, if we don't know the edition sizes of, say, this 1557 Youth or the 1551 Lusty Juvenis, we don't know exactly how many copies printed. Let's say, for the sake of discussion, somewhere between 300 copies and 500 copies of one of these mid-Tudor playbooks that were printed. Even at that number, which is relatively low, certainly by modern standards, but even by the standards that would emerge by the time you get into the 17th century, that's still too many copies to sell to only people who want to perform the play. That is to say, it's very unlikely that there are 300, 500 customers out there that actually buy the play with the idea of actually performing it. And so there seems to be something just about the economy of the economics of the book trade that demand that in order to be successful, these books don't only cater to an interest in performance. And then we start to see, as you get these sort of doubling schemes represented on title pages with lists of characters, you also then start to see something weird that sort of pulls against that. In that same 1551 Lusty Juvenis playbook that I mentioned, at the very end of the play, after all the text is done, it says finis, which means the end, and then under that it says quod R. Weaver. And so we think Weaver is the author of the play, and quod is that Middle English verb from Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, quoth the Raven, quoted Richard Weaver, so spoken by Richard Weaver. And so we have this sort of strange juxtaposition of a piece of information that says you could perform this play with 4 actors, and then at the very end of the play there's an assertion of authorship that's saying this whole play was spoken by one guy, the author of the play. And that strikes me as something that is more to do with the act of reading than the act of performance. And so you see playbooks trying to make themselves legible to a range of audiences, and as you go on, it seems like the playbooks are actually adapting to, I think, the reality that the vast majority of playbook readers are people who are sitting down to read the play and not to perform the play. And increasingly, it seems like people are sitting down to read the play and not even trying to imagine the performance while they're reading it. So that movement, I think, in the sort of around 1615 or so, to sort of clearly scenic woodcuts, strikes me as this sort of maybe this kind of tipping point where it is that publishers and their readership all understand that really the use function of the playbook by that point is one that is really built around, if not exclusively private reading, certainly a lot of private reading. Okay, so that's my attempt to answer the very first question we had. From Ian, I'm curious if the illustrations in playbooks followed similar trends in other genres of the time, or if playbook illustrations were unique. No, they're not unique. And this is, I think, one of the things that can be kind of tricky. I think a lot of the reason why modern scholars have had a hard time sort of understanding playbooks as sort of catering to a readerly audience is the fact that scholars of drama in English departments tend not to be the same as scholars of poetry and prose fiction, and they're certainly not historians. And so one of the things that we often see, I think, is we miss these connections between printed plays and other kinds of pamphlets, all of which, especially kind of occasional pamphlets, ballads, news books, all kinds of early publications have illustrations on them that try to distill something about the sort of plot-based content or the content of the text there. One of the illustrations that comes to mind is from a news book where it shows a guy having like hacked off the head and arms of some people, and it's a pamphlet about a recent murder. And that woodcut, albeit a little gory, would make perfect sense in the context of a playbook where we have this sort of, they're showing the contours of the earth, they're showing a major character, they're showing a major bit of action. And that kind of language of the title page woodcut is something that I think the playbook shares in common with other forms and genres in England. I do mention in the exhibit itself and on the labels in that particular blog post that some of these woodcuts that were used in playbooks, even of the scenic kind, seem to have been reused from other books. The most obvious of which, I think, is the Arden of Faversham woodcut that is too much in landscape mode to fit on the title page of the playbook. And so the publisher, Elizabeth Aldie, has had to put it on the back of the title page, and you actually have to turn the book sideways in order to see it. And in fact, just because I'm here, I have my trusty Arden of Faversham mug, complete with full woodcut scene, which I've had for a very long time. And I'm also terrified to see that my brother has joined this Facebook live feed. Let me drink some water here. So in any rate, Ian, playbook illustrations are not unique, but it does seem like that there is this kind of boom in scenic playbook illustrations from right around 1615 to sometime in the early 1630s, that it seems like at that point there's this sort of publisher interest and presumably some sort of reader response to the commissioning of specific woodcuts for specific title pages. And to get to Aaron Blake's question, one of the things that I stupidly forgot to put in the exhibition was an edition, a later 17th century edition we have of Beaumont and Fletcher's The Maid's Tragedy. The Maid's Tragedy, so Claire Bourne has written a bit about these particular playbooks by these two playwrights, Beaumont and Fletcher, that get illustrated, I think, 1619, the early 1620s, if I'm remembering correctly. And The Maid's Tragedy is one that we actually do have a copy of here at the Ransom Center. that I just simply forgot about. So that was a bit embarrassing, because those Beaumont and Fletcher title page woodcuts are ones that unequivocally were produced specifically for the printed play edition themselves. And so one of the things that I often read about from theater historians is that theater historians sort of like the idea that the woodblock was made for a ballad or made for a prose fiction account and not for the play, because the second that the playbook itself has an identity as a source of fiction, it becomes harder to read the play as something that is tied as closely to performance, or that tells us as much about performance as we might like. It's worth just mentioning that, you know, the vast majority of plays that we have from this period, Shakespeare, Marlowe, Kidd, we have these plays because they were published in printed editions, not because we have theatrical manuscripts. There are some manuscripts that survive, there are some theatrical manuscripts that survive, but the vast majority that we know about the early modern stage comes from printed playbooks. And so the more that we have an independent reason for printed playbooks to exist, the less we have the ability for, the more that we have evidence of there being an independent reason for printed playbooks to exist, the less we have a reason to sort of see them as just tightly connected to performance as we would like. That is to say, why do certain plays go into print? Does that have anything to do with the world of the theater? What exactly makes its way into the playbook from the world of performance? That may not have as much to do with the theater if we can see publishers interested in serving a readership that is interested in something like private reading. Okay. So I really wish I could have included the Maid's Tragedy. One of the things I also wanted to include, and I've posted some pictures of this on Twitter recently, is there are all kinds of performance that's happening in early modern England. Performance scholars can tell you all about that. We have an edition at the Ransom Center of a book called The Arches of Triumph that was published in 1604, if I remember correctly, that shows these triumphal arches, these pieces of architecture that were made for the coronation procession, the delayed coronation procession for James I. And that has verses that were written by some of the major playwrights of the period. And that's a kind of performance, right? The idea that when the king enters London officially for the first time as the new king, he goes through the city of London and shows off in pomp and circumstance his power and the number of elite people that he can sort of get to follow along with him. And we have an edition of The Arches of Triumph, which is an elaborately engraved large format book that shows these various arches that were made for the procession. And I wanted to include that, but it was a bit too big. So to get to Aaron's particular question, it's a little too big to include in the case. And I also thought it stretched the definition of a play, but I thought it did so in a useful way, because one of the things that we can see is evidence of people wanting to see spectacle. And I think the illustrations in the Arches of Triumph, which show those arches, is one that actually caters quite explicitly to some sort of memorialization of the act of playbook, or of the act of performance itself. And so that's a kind of counterexample, I think, to illustrations that I've been most interested in. Okay, I need more questions. I'll wait a second and drink some water here. Let's see here. I don't think I'm actually seeing all the questions, which is interesting. Okay. So I guess we've got a gap in some questions. So now I have to yammer at you for a little bit more. Okay, so, one of the things that I'm also interested in is, with this particular show, is sort of how it is that, how's the best way to say this? So there's the basic story I want to tell of the playbook, sort of patterns of playbook use justifying to publishers the expense of making and commissioning a title page illustration that seems to be interested in the fictional world of the play. But I'm also interested in general too, and just sort of how it is that the mechanics of how these things get manufactured in the first place. So we've talked a little bit about reuse. And one of the things that, I was talking a moment ago about how there's a way in which sort of theater historians have tended to like the idea of the playbook illustration having been recycled from some other form, because then it suggests like, oh, well, that's not trying to say anything about the identity of the playbook in any meaningful way, and it's certainly not trying to say anything about performance. But my sense is that actually the more places you see these woodcuts associated with the story and not the performance, the more that is sort of evidence in favor of the argument that I'm trying to advance, again, which is that these playbooks are interested in trying to say something about, these title page illustrations are trying to say something about the ways plays are being read for fiction. There are a couple playbooks in the display that kind of push at the edge of my expertise. One of the last ones I include is a really interesting playbook called The Empress of Morocco by Elkina Settle. And this was published in the 1670s. And so one of the things for those of you who aren't dyed-in-the-wool early modern drama people is that from the early 1640s, during the English Civil War, to the restoration of Charles II in 1660, there aren't the public theaters or the commercial theaters in London are shut down. Complicated set of reasons for that, often chalked up to sort of slightly incorrect ideas about Puritans not liking plays. That's not exactly right. But the plays are the London theaters are shut down for quite a period. I mean, almost 20 years. And when the theater comes back, we have seen evolutions in the sort of technologies of the stage. And so one of these playhouses, which is called the Dorset Garden Theatre, I think it was called the Duke of York's Theatre in its earliest years. This particular theatre, which was in play by the early 1670s when Elkina Settle wrote The Empress of Morocco, this particular playhouse could incorporate movable backdrops. And so you could actually have painted backdrops that could be wheeled in and swapped out between scenes. And they also had technology that strikes me as very terrifying, where they could fly people on ropes. They could suspend people and move them in the air. And so with these new technologies, the painted backdrop and these sort of architectures of being able to move people through space more effectively, it's actually possible now for London stages to be able to show aspects of the fictional world of the play on the stage that actually, prior to that, had been really more the province of the printed playbook. That is to say, things like elaborate sort of scenic backgrounds, making people fly in certain ways, those kinds of things. And so when the very first time I saw a copy of Empress of Morocco, which I hope you can see it on the blog post, but the playbook starts off with a frontispiece of the Dorset Garden Theatre. So it shows you the outside of the theater, and then it's got a title page that shows that we're, this Empress of Morocco, such and such, 1673. And then once you get in the play, there are 5 different plates, 5 different illustrations that are included. And each of those illustrations includes the sort of proscenium arch, what you would see looking at the front of the stage, the top and the sides. And then inside of it, it shows a single scene. And one of the things that's exciting to me is that, that particular proscenium, that outside bit, the part that shows you what the outside of the stage looked like, that would be the same for all 5 of the scenes. And so when it came to actually making the illustrations, it would have been a real pain for the engraver to have to recut exactly the same image 5 times. And so they came up with a fairly ingenious method that the engraver cut a single plate that shows the outside of the stage, the proscenium arch. And then they cut separate plates of the scenes themselves. And so each of the illustrations actually involves 2 passes through the printing press. Through the engraving press, through the roller press. One of the things about engravings, we're in for a deep dive. So one of the things about the woodcut is the woodcut actually, because it's a relief technology, one where you actually cut away from the block so that the lines that you're printing are on the surface, the wood block can fit in the printing press with the metal type that prints the text in the work. And so with a woodcut, as long as you can fit the woodcut in the bed of the press alongside the type, you can print it at the same time. And so you have a single pass process that's actually fairly economical. Engravings tend to be able to get a higher degree of detail, but engravings work differently than woodcuts. They're using what's called an intaglio technology, where the engraver or etcher cuts into a copper plate, cuts in the lines that they want to see, but those lines are cut into the plate, not sticking up from the plate like in the woodcut. And so in order for those to be printed in engraving, ink had to be put on the surface of the plate, and then actually wiped off of the surface of the plate so that it's only left in the cut-in grooves. And then that particular plate has a piece of paper smashed on top of it, and it goes through a very high-pressure roller press. This is simplifying things a bit. And so then, as it does that, the paper gets pushed into the lines that are incised in the plate. So in any event, the point of that, me mentioning that, is A, it's cool to know how engravings are made, but it's also, I think, relevant because it means that you actually have to involve another technology. That is to say, another workflow is required to integrate engravings into a printed book that is primarily made from letterpress or from a kind of relief letterpress process. And that means that you had to actually care. And so whenever you see an engraving in a book, especially in the sort of 17th century in England, it means that the publisher took on an extra expense because they saw it being worth their while to invest in the copper plates and having somebody print the plates through a separate press. That's made even more intense in the case of Empress of Morocco, because in Empress of Morocco, every one of the, so we have the title page plate, which is one plate, and then you've got 5 other plates that have to go through. And each one of those plates had to go through the engraving press twice. One for the scene bit, one for the arch, and then one for the scene inside of it. And so for each of those 5 illustrations, we have 10 passes through an engraving press, plus an 11th pass for the title, the frontispiece that shows the theater. And that, I think, shows that this is quite an achievement. So what the publisher has done, or what the engraving printer had done, is say, you know what, I will save more time by only cutting the theater scene once than by having, I'll lose by having to print each of the plates twice, one for the arch, one for the scene. But in any event, when I had first seen Empress of Morocco, a printed edition of it, I was really confused because the pictures inside, the scene pictures themselves, didn't look to me at all like they were trying to show what's happening on a stage. They really looked to me like almost entirely fictional illustrations that exceed even those that we saw in the woodcuts. But when you start reading scholars who know stuff about the early modern theater, you can actually, once you can reframe them once you realize that these plates are showing off new theatrical technologies. And so for me, they sort of initially suggested that these allow the playbook to be sort of even more independent of the stage. But they also, at the same time, allow you to see the stage itself. Okay, so I think we've got some more questions. All right. Whoa, we got lots of questions. Holy smokes. Okay. So let's see here. We've got so many. All right. What happens to the illustrations across time? Okay, Megan, it's a good question. I'm not sure I'm going to have the best answer for you. I mean, obviously, there are some cases where the woodcuts get reused over and over again, or rather have to get recut. And so one of the best examples of this, and I'm not sure if I'm getting your question spot on, but that, if we go back to Dr. Faustus, the copy of Dr. Faustus that we have here at the Ransom Center, it's from 1663. In the wood block that's used to print it, you can see that it has a huge crack across the middle, where the wood block has probably expanded and contracted due to the changes in moisture across the seasons. This is one of the reasons we think that wood blocks crack, is that over the seasons they get wet and dry, and then they crack like wood I'm sure you're used to seeing normally. And so the original 1616 illustrated edition of Faustus used one wood block, and we know that wood block was also involved in prose tracts about the Faustus story. And then over time, and I can't remember the total number of wood blocks, but over the 17th century, we see the Dr. Faustus woodcut get recut a number of times. And so it suggests that it wasn't that like they kept including the woodcut or Dr. Faustus in new editions of the play simply because it was convenient. The block was sitting around. The illustration of Faustus was considered so integral to the playbook that it was worth it for the publisher of the new editions to recommission a new woodblock based on the previous one. And so one of the things I really like is that you can actually see in the recutting of some of these blocks, particularly the Dr. Faustus block, in the recutting of that block, you see an enduring publisher commitment to making sure that illustration is there. And I think that in the case of Dr. Faustus, I think that speaks fairly strongly to the idea that really that illustration was inextricable from the play by the time you get into the second decade of the 17th century, 1620s, 30s, 40s. Okay. That was one attempt at answering the question of how these illustrations across time. I should say that I didn't include, this gets maybe back to Aaron Blake's earlier question. One of the things I didn't really talk about, and you'll see, if you go back to my blog post, you'll see that I was a little careful in the language that I use when I talk about playbook title page illustrations that actually show the scene on them. So I show an example from the Three Lords and Three Ladies of London. That's a playbook from 1590, where the publisher of that had a woodblock from like a printer who had just quit printing that had nothing to do with the play, from an allegorical work. So okay, well, that's a illustration that shows some dudes looking at like a stage full of women, and like our play's about women and some dudes, and so I'll just use that here because it sort of shows something happening on a stage. And that's a kind of opportunistic use, but it's very clear that Richard Jones, when he published that particular edition, was reusing the woodblock because it sort of allowed some connection to the world of performance. That is, it shows a stage. But I'm careful here because I say, and I'm going to read it, the use of that block on the title page of Wilson's play marks the only time before 1673, the Empress of Morocco, that the publisher of an English language playbook used an illustration that explicitly zooms out from play characters or narrative action and depicts a performance in progress on the stage. And I said English language there advisedly, because I didn't want to get into the deep black hole of trying to talk about closet drama or Latin drama. There was a play, a Latin university play, and so the universities often conducted themselves in Latin, and that's true for the plays that were written for universities as well in many cases. And there's a guy, William Alabaster, who wrote a play called Roxana in Latin in the 1590s. And in the 1630s, it finally was printed while our boy William Alabaster was still alive. There was an unauthorized edition, but then the second edition of it, published in 1632, has a title page frontispiece that kind of surrounds the title page, the text of saying the title and who published it. And in the very bottom center, it actually shows actors on a stage and audience members above it and in front of it. And so there's an example where, for a play that we don't at all associate with the London commercial theaters of English language plays, that particular playbook does seem to show a stage, does show a stage where actors are on it. But of course, that's a playbook that was really at that point relatively well divorced from the stage. 1630s, I think we don't. My memory's correct. We don't know of any performances of Roxana from after the 1590s, but I might be not entirely right about that. So there's an example of something that I kind of wanted to include because it does provide a kind of counterexample that I think actually reinforces the broader point that depictions of the stage in early modern English playbooks are quite rare indeed. Okay, so let's see here. Kurt, can you tell us about Forsheimer as a collector in the foresight in gathering this material back in the 1920s and 30s? Okay, so this is a great question, and it allows me to not reiterate a bunch of the points that I've been making so far. So Carl Forsheimer, so I am the Carl and Lily Forsheimer Curator of Early Books and Manuscripts. My position was endowed in 1986 after the Ransom Center purchased a collection of books of English literature from 1475 to 1700 that were collected by Carl Forsheimer, a New Yorker who, among other things, was one of the founders of the American Stock Exchange. He was not a poor man. He specialized in Standard Oil stock after the monopoly was busted. So this is a guy who had a lot of cash and assembled an incredibly large collection of printed books, not only English literature, but also our Gutenberg Bible at the Ransom Center was once owned by Carl Forsheimer. He owned a lot of books of what we now call incunabula, books printed in the first 50 years or so in the second half of the 15th century in Europe. He collected 18th century books. He had this massive collection of books by Shelley in his circle that's now at the New York Public Library. Carl Forsheimer was an avid book collector, and he was somebody who studied the books quite seriously. I've looked at his invoices at the NYPL, and he owns almost all of the major reference works, including reference works about watermarks, the kind of hardcore stuff of bibliography. And Forsheimer, he was collecting primarily, as you say, Kurt, in the 1920s and 30s. I mean, he was collecting really at a time after the huge boom in American collecting of English literary books. So by the late 19th century, America, because of the Industrial Revolution, has a hell of a lot more money than Europe, and certainly a hell of a lot more money than England. And so Americans start vacuuming up the cultural patrimony of England, because of course Americans at that time, especially elite Americans, still saw England as its sort of literary father, and were interested in collecting the books that came from, the culture before America. And Americans, especially robber barons, these kind of robber barons, are vacuuming up tons of playbooks in that period, usually right before they die. And so a lot of these playbooks, like our early Shakespeare editions at the Ransom Center, switched hands 4 or 5 times within 15 years. So Forsheimer was really kind of collecting actually on the back of a major wave of American collecting, and really on the back of an earlier wave of English gentlemen collecting of English plays and English literature. What was interesting about Forsheimer is that, to me anyway, aside from amassing a truly amazing collection, is that he was interested in trying to get books in quote unquote original condition as much as he could. I've talked about this in another context when I did Collated Imperfect display at the Ransom Center, and a panel, a Forsheimer lecture panel, and a printed publication a while back. And in that particular book, that particular context, I talk about Forsheimer being a collector who really liked things like early bindings in original condition. He owned a copy of Shakespeare's Richard II from 1634 that is still stab stitched. It's still stitched as a pamphlet, as it was originally sold in the 1630s. That it had been in the collection of a woman named Frances Wolferston, who probably was its first owner in the 1630s. And so Forsheimer was really a kind of a pioneer to some extent, at least with English books, in not wanting the clean copies that looked super good on a gentleman's bookshelf, but in wanting copies that said something about the way that they originally circulated. So I think he was somebody who I see not necessarily as like of his own kind. He's not the only one who's doing this, but I see him as an important milestone in a transition away from collecting books that look like old books that look like modern books, to collecting old books and wanting them to look as much like old books as possible. Okay, so many things. Let's see. Chrissy again, there were so many editions of the playbooks. Were they trying to reissue them with different images to create more interest and more sales? Very good question. I do talk about 2 particular playbooks in the display that I'll just mention now. So one thing is that both the Spanish Tragedy and Dr. Faustus get title page illustrations after they had been published before without them. There seems to be some desire, to sort of breathe new life perhaps into an old play, although it should be said that both the Spanish Tragedy and Dr. Faustus were playbooks that had sold pretty well. And so when the publishers who commissioned illustrations, who got illustrations for them, included them on the title pages, they weren't taking a huge risk exactly. I mean, these were plays that had been, to the extent that you can talk about a bestseller for a play, had been the bestsellers of plays. Maybe better examples for our purposes are Arden of Faversham and Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay. These playbooks had been published originally, at the end of the 16th century. And in the 1630s, when Elizabeth Aldie is reissuing them, these are plays that really hadn't been published in quite a while. And so when she includes illustrations on their title page, I think there's a fairly strong case to be made that she seems to be interested in drumming up new interest in this particularly old play by including an illustration to say, hey, this is a play, even though it's old, it's worth paying attention to now. We also know in the case of Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay that the woodcut on that playbook had been used for a prose account of the history of Friar Bacon. So there's also a kind of other ecosystem of media that suggested maybe to Elizabeth Aldie that there might be interest in the Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay story in the 1630s. That's a very good question, because we do see, at least in those instances, old plays getting dressed up with new woodcuts. Um, Megan, again, let's see here. What happens to the illustrations? Wait, I got that one. What happens to the illustrations across time? This is a different question. Do editors preserve them, refer to them, take them seriously as evidence of contemporary reading? Now, there are a lot of people probably on this feed that know a lot more about this than I do. But one of the things that I think, with the Dr. Faustus woodcut, for example, it'd be pretty hard to find, especially certainly a dedicated edition, but even an anthologized edition in the Norton Anthology of Dr. Faustus that doesn't include the illustration. I don't think that's quite as true, especially of editions from the 90s and earlier of some of these other plays that include illustrations. The idea, of course, being that the illustration really isn't about the play. It's about the playbook. And so one of the things when you're editing a literary text, and this will be old hat for many people in this live chat, but one of the things you're editing a play is you have to choose what exactly it is that you're trying to represent to your readers. Are you trying to represent this sort of weirdness of the authorial intention, whatever the author thought they were doing? Are you trying to give readers a sense of what the play text looked like when it was performed in whatever year? That's another thing that can be connected to the question of author's intention. Or are you trying to show the playbook as it was published for readers? And that latter sort of way of editing, that editing the playbook and not necessarily the play as performance, is not exactly new, but it's certainly newer, and it's something that editors have been embracing more in the past decade or two, where there's less of an idea that you can read through the playbook to get back to the London stage. And so I think with that sort of realization that we kind of can't really back our way through the playbook necessarily to the stage, I think there's been more interest in trying to say, well, this is the playbook as it was published, this is the playbook as it was read, and it's incumbent then on the editor to preserve more of the features. And so it's very, very common to see title pages reproduced in edited editions that include these illustrations when they're available. Okay, so that's one attempt at that. We've got a few more minutes here, and I want to get to some other questions rapidly. Mark Davis, with reference to your discussion of the uses of plays, first for those who wish to perform them, but second for those who want to read the play as fiction, imagining the context setting rather than reading as a play. In Shakespeare's First Folio by Emma Smith, she describes that use through on interlineations made by individual owners of a copy of the folio. I'd have to think about exactly the particular copies you're talking about, Mark, but there are definitely copies of the First Folio where we know they were marked up for performance, usually a little bit later. There are a couple of copies we could talk about for that. But then there are, of course, also copies of the First Folio that have annotations of people responding to them as poetry, marking out lines that have a particular sweetness to them, or marking out lines that are what we call sententiae or commonplaces. As you see this in the Quarto playbooks too, lines that are sweet and sort of portable for their quality as literature or their quality of wit. And so you even, in something like the First Folio or the Quarto playbooks, you often see annotation that suggests a kind of range of types of reading, sometimes with this sort of idea of performance, often by folks in the later 17th century and the 18th century when they're trying to kind of imagine the theatrical world of yesteryear. But just as often, if not more often, you see annotations in First Folios and in the Quarto playbooks that are trying to give us a sense of what the sort of quality of the verses, or just like making simple corrections like, this stage direction is wrong, this this speech prefix is incorrect. And of course, those kinds of emendations apply just as much to performance as they do for the sort of readerly legibility of the work. Matthew Harrison, okay. When Faustus is reprinted, it seems to have new versions of the same woodcut. It has been recut. Is that typical? I don't think so. Faustus, and I'd have to, go back through my like deep black hole of notes or go back to the database of early English playbooks to look this up. But I can't think of other English playbooks from the period that involve title page illustration recuts. And I know I'm gonna be missing something when I say that, but Faustus does seem to have a particular fame, a particular interest, both because of the play and because of the prose narrative about the Faustus story that seemed to kind of keep it in circulation in a way that doesn't seem to be true of the other earlier illustrations. That said, we see those Beaumont and Fletcher playbooks that have illustrations that I mentioned at the very beginning of this Q&A. those, to the best of my knowledge, those blocks don't get recut. I think they keep reusing them, although I'd want to ask Claire Bourne about that because I'm not 100% sure. But my understanding is that really the life of those title page illustrations for non-Faustus plays sort of depends to some extent on the endurance of the original woodblock that was cut for them. But I'm sure somebody here can correct me if I'm wrong with that. Okay, Emily, what would you want to get across to scholars if you could get theater historians, early modern drama scholars, etc., all together? Is there a thread or point that you would most want to make sure they all consider when writing about early modern and illustrated plays? Yeah, I think, I mean, there are a number of things, like my wheelhouse is sort of reevaluating the Quarto playbook. But I think if there were one thing I think I'd want to emphasize is that, and I've said this, I wrote an article for a special issue of a journal that was edited by Andy Kesson about the 1580s. And in that particular article, I mentioned that, from the beginning of printed plays in England, there were printed plays with illustrations, and there are people that were reading plays from the very beginning of the English book trade, to the extent that we can talk about it emerging in the late 15th and early 16th century. And because the playbook as a market category long precedes the emergence of the commercial theaters like the Globe and these companies that we associate with the kind of high Renaissance, the kind that are typically taught in undergraduate courses, because the printed playbook precedes those playbooks, the playbooks that come out of the London theaters, by a number of decades. I think it's really important to just remember that the printed playbook has an independent existence of the stage, of the commercial stage in particular. And that when we think about printed playbooks, we really have to remember that the playbook is a type of book, and that the play, or maybe a different way to say that, is that plays are both a thing that gets performed and a type of book. And the reasons for the existence of the thing that gets performed and the thing that exists of the book might not be the same thing. And so I think that we always have to entertain the possibility, and I think entertain it very seriously, that printed playbooks could have a reason for existing and could satisfy a set of readerly interests that are quite distinct from the world of performance that made a lot of these plays exist in the first place. Okay, Robert Stagg, how are you doing? Are there any illustrations, et cetera, which you found posed a serious challenge to the main argument you're making? Which, if he understands me correctly, that I'm arguing that these illustrations take us more or less directly into the fiction. Look, one of the things that anybody who's spent time with playbooks would tell me, and they would be right to tell me, is that at the same time that you see these illustrations emerging that are scenic in kind, playbook title pages say more and more about who performed them, what the theater company was, and where they were performed. And so, beginning in 1601, we see the Blackfriars Theater mentioned on title pages. Beginning in 1608, with some Shakespeare plays and a couple others, we see the Globe mentioned on them. And before that, we see the names of theatrical acting troupes mentioned on title pages. And so what we see, I think, is, I mentioned before that in the early 16th century, the mid 16th century, that it seems like publishers are trying to figure out what the hell playbooks are for. And when they're doing that, I think they just keep adding more and more stuff that could make the playbook attractive to a reader. And so it's not that you see a sort of transition away from theatrical pedigree being emphasized. You could perform this yourself, or this company performed it. You just see more of like a kitchen sink approach, where it's like anything that could possibly make you interested in the playbook, possibly make you buy it, they throw in there. So you get things that cater to theatrical interest. So if you're in London and you're a playgoer, or you're maybe no longer in London because you're not a kid at the Inns of Court anymore and you've moved out to your country home, you still might want to know what the Kingsmen are doing or what's going on at the Globe. And so playbooks certainly try to cater to that, at the same time that they make themselves more and more extricable from those conditions of performance, so that you actually see the playbook able to cater to all of these strategies of reading simultaneously. And I think that's an important thing to emphasize. I've been sort of framing this more as a kind of polemic to say, people were reading plays as fiction. And I think that's absolutely true. And in fact, I suspect that that's the dominant way people are reading plays. But that doesn't mean that aspects of theatricality aren't important to making the play legible to readers. one of the illustrations that I talk through that does pose a bit of a challenge is the one to the Roaring Girl from 1611. So the Roaring Girl, shows Moll Cutpurse or Moll Frith on the stage, or in her manly costume, standing on something that looks like a wooden floor. And I think it's not unreasonable to argue that that particular illustration is trying to show the stage. We know from, as I mentioned in the blog post, we know that she actually appeared on a public theater stage dressed in man's apparels. In the epilogue at the end of the play itself, mentions that the Roaring Girl will appear on the stage soon and give larger recompense. And so there's an example where I think we have an illustration that fits fairly firmly in the tradition of illustrating major characters on playbook title pages, but also at the same time, I think, gives some sense that there may be something about her appearing on the stage that's important to this. Again, it's a sort of all as, or a sort of yes and kind of reading of how exactly these playbooks make themselves legible. Okay, let me see if I can get one more in here before we're done. From Mark again, interesting about Pforzheimer. Question from Jeffrey. Lots of core to say as performed at. And I think that's, so you say, doesn't that suggest some function as souvenir or savor the memory? I guess that's a question. On the one hand, I think it could say like, oh man, I saw that play at such and such place by such and such theater company. Man, I'd love to own that. Very possibly. But one of the things that as performed by, when it mentions the theater companies, or even when it mentions a particular theater, is that it's not obvious to me that those are necessarily trying to tell you, like, you need to imagine this play as it happened on the stage at the Globe. I think these can actually work as authenticators, which is to say they can act like an author's name. So say I like the plays of William Shakespeare. So when I see a playbook title page with William Shakespeare's name on it, I think maybe that's one I want to read. I actually think some of these performance markers, as performed by the King's Men or as performed at the Globe, I think those can also act as not necessarily things that are trying to make you think like, what did it look like at the Globe, but making you think, damn, I like those Globe plays, or damn, I like those plays by the King's Men, and now I will go home and read it. And so it's not obvious to me that even these things that are explicitly theatrical and they're sort of marking a pedigree are actually ones that are enforcing or suggesting a reading the play as performed, exactly, if that makes sense. Okay, let's see, we got one more question here. From Mark. The interesting thing I saw in the interrelations by owners of the folios was that a number of them made the same change. For example, in Hamlet, there's a line by Ophelia's father that is better suited to Hamlet, and a number of the owners changed the character saying the line from Hamlet to the father. That's right. I mean, one of the things that I think we see, and there's been a lot of discussion recently about a second folio, in Philadelphia that we're pretty sure at this point was owned by John Milton, the poet of Paradise Lost and a number of other things. And one of the things that we see in a lot of these corrections and emendations is somebody trying to make sense of the play. And so I mentioned before, in these quartos and in some of the first folios, you see corrections or changing of speech prefixes. These strike me as they, in some cases you can imagine them, okay, we need to change the speech prefix because I want to perform it, or I'm doing something else with this playbook so that I can make it happen in performance again. But I think it strikes me as the activity of a close reader, however they're reading it, right? So they may not be reading it, for fiction, as I'm suggesting, they might be reading it for performance, but either way, they're thinking like, okay, I'm reading this story, I'm reading this play, I'm reading this script, and this particular line doesn't strike me as one that it would make sense for that character to say. It should be this other character. And I think that strikes me as this kind of attentive reading that isn't necessarily one that's sort of in this fictional way that I'm suggesting, but is certainly imagine somebody that's immersed in the story of the play, whether geared toward performance or sort of fiction, narrative fiction. And again, that distinction's a muddy one. So I think that's exactly right. We do see people engaging with these playbooks very closely. And I think in part because of that evidence of close reading of plays, this is the wrong speech, or this bit of verse is really good. Because of that kind of evidence of attentive reading and the kind of evidence that I talk about in the way that these illustrations present themselves, is I think it becomes very, very difficult to sort of disaggregate the playbook, the printed playbook, from other kinds of imaginative literature that are being written in the period. And so it's not obvious to me that somebody reading, Richard II or Musidorus, or maybe Musidorus, is reading that play completely differently than they would be reading, a prose work by like Philip Sidney's Arcadia or Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queen. That all of these books exist in a kind of imaginative ecosystem where you have formal differences and often many generic differences as well, but that all of these books can be, and I think were read by readers who were very attentive to the world that they were trying to create in the language that they were trying to convey. Okay, it is 12:30. I'm exhausted. I need more coffee. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is the first time I've ever done anything like this. And so thanks very much. I'm going to go ahead and sign off because I am done. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.